Well, good afternoon. Here we are, another Saturday. I was off for a wee bit, took a break, partially because I was waiting on exam results. And you know how it is. You just, like, if you're waiting on news, you know the way you can't do anything. Partially that, and partially I've been playing the new Elden Ring DLC. I haven't been streaming it because A, I don't know how, and B, it's just me crying and screaming, please don't touch me, the entire time the things are chasing me. So in terms of gameplay, you're not missing much. But my specialty is reading, so what we're going to do is give our new Harry Potter book a read. I've decided to go with the third one, just because uh, I think it's probably most people's favourites. And it was the first one that was ever read to me, in fact. Way back whenever I was in primary school, we had a teacher who used to read us Harry Potter's chapters of them just whenever we'd come back from lunch. She used to be one of the ones, you know, the way whenever you come back in and you're filing in line. I don't know if this is the same with American schools, it is for the UK. But you've lined up and you're waiting to come back in, and then you go in line by line, and there's teachers sort of standing all along the corridor, or prefects if you're secondary school. But in primary school, it's the teachers, and as you go past and up the stairs, you'd see your teacher there, and she'd be standing and she'd be holding Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, and you knew you were in for a good afternoon. Well, without further ado, we'll begin. Chapter 1. I'll post. Harry Potter was a highly unusual boy in many ways. For one thing, he hated the summer holidays more than any other time of year. For another, he really wanted to do his homework and was forced to do it in secret in the dead of night. He also happened to be a wizard. It was nearly midnight and he was lying on his front in bed, the blankets drawn tight over his head like a tent, torch in one hand, large leather-bound book, A History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot, propped open against the pillow. Harry moved the tip of his eagle feather quill down the page, frowning as he looked for something that would help him write his essay, which was witch burning in the 14th century, and was completely pointless. Discuss. The quill paused at the top of a likely-looking paragraph. Harry pushed his round glasses up his nose, moving his torch closer to the book, and read, "Non-magic people, more commonly known as muggles, are particularly afraid of magic and were in medieval times, but not very good at recognizing it. On the rare occasion that they did catch a real witch or wizard, burning had no effect whatsoever. The witch or wizard would perform a basic flame freezing charm and then pretend to shriek in pain while enjoying a gentle tickling sensation. Indeed, Gwendolen the wizard enjoyed being burnt so much that she allowed herself to be caught no fewer than 47 times in various disguises." Harry put his quill between his teeth and reached underneath his pillow for his ink bottle and roll of parchment. Slowly and very carefully, he unscrewed the bottle of ink, dipped his quill into it, and began to write, pausing every now and then to listen, because if any Dursleys heard the scratching of his quill on their way to the bathroom, he'd probably find himself locked up in the cupboard under the stairs for the rest of summer. The Dursley family of number 4 Privet Drive was the very reason that Harry had never enjoyed his summer holidays. Uncle Vernon, Aunt Virginia, and their son, Dudley, were Harry's only living relatives. They were muggles, and they had a very medieval attitude towards magic. Harry's dead parents, who had been a witch and wizard themselves, were never mentioned under the Dursleys' roof. For years, Aunt Virginia and Uncle Vernon had hoped that if they kept Harry as downtrodden as possible, they would be able to squash the magic out of them. To their fury, they had been unsuccessful, and now lived in terror of anyone finding out that Harry had spent most of the last 2 years at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The most the Dursleys could do these days was lock away Harry's spellbooks, wand, cauldron, and broomstick at the start of the summer holidays, and forbid him to talk to his neighbours. This separation from his spellbooks had been a real problem for Harry because his teachers at Hogwarts had given him a lot of holiday homework. One of the essays, a particularly nasty one about shrinking potions, was for Harry's least favourite teacher, Professor Snape, who would be delighted to have an excuse to give Harry detention for a month. Harry had therefore seized his chance in the first week of the holidays, while Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia and Dudley had gone out into the front garden to admire Uncle Vernon's new company car in very loud voices so the rest of the street would notice it too. Harry had crept downstairs, picked the lock on the cupboard under the stairs, grabbed some books, and hidden them in his bedroom. As long as he didn't leave any ink spots on the sheets, the Dursleys would never need to know that he was studying magic at night. Harry was keen to avoid trouble with his aunt and uncle at the moment, as they were in a bad mood with him. All because he'd received a telephone call from a fellow wizard one week into the school holidays. Ron Weasley, who was Harry's best friend at Hogwarts, had come from a whole family of wizards. This meant that he knew a whole lot of things Harry didn't. But he'd never used a telephone before. Most unluckily, it had been Uncle Vernon who had answered the call. Vernon Dursley speaking. Harry, who happened to be in the room at the time, froze as he heard Ron answer. Hello, hello, can you hear me? I want to talk to Harry Potter. Ron was yelling so loudly that Uncle Vernon jumped and held the receiver away from his ear, staring at it with an expression of mingled fury and alarm. Who is this? He roared in the direction of the mouthpiece. Who are you? Ron Weasley, Ron bellowed back as though he and Uncle Vernon were speaking from opposite ends of a football pitch. I'm a friend of Harry's from school. Uncle Vernon's small eyes swiveled to Harry, who was rooted to the spot. There's no Harry Potter here, he roared, now holding the receiver at arm's length, as though frightened it might explode. I don't know what school you're talking about. Never contact me again. Don't you come near my family. He threw the receiver back down to the telephone, as if he was dropping a poisonous spider. The row that had followed had been one of the worst ever. How dare you give this number to people like you, Vernon had roared, spraying Harry with spit. Ron obviously realised he'd gotten Harry in trouble because he hadn't called again. Harry's other best friend from Hogwarts, Hermione Granger, hadn't been in touch either. Harry suspected that Ron had warned Hermione not to call, which was a pity because Hermione, the cleverest witch in Harry's year, had Muggle parents and knew well how to use a telephone, and would probably have had enough sense to say that she didn't go to Hogwarts. So Harry had no word from either of his wizarding friends for 5 long weeks, and this summer was turning out to be almost as bad as the last one. There was just one very small improvement. After swearing that he wouldn't use her to send any letters to his friends, Harry had been allowed to let his owl, Hedwig, out at night. Uncle Vernon had given in because of the racket Hedwig made if she was locked in her cage all the time. Harry finished writing about Gwendolen the Weird and paused to listen again. The silence in the dark house was broken only by the distant, grunting snores of his enormous cousin, Dudley. It must be very late. Harry's eyes were itching with tiredness. Perhaps he'd finish his essay tomorrow night. He replaced the bottle of ink and the top of it, and pulled the old pillowcase from under his bed, put the torch, a history of magic, and his essay, quill and ink inside it, then got into bed and hid the lot under a loose floorboard under his bed. He then stood up, stretched, and checked the time with the luminous alarm clock on his bedside table. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Harry's stomach gave a funny jolt. He'd been 13 years old, without realising it, for a whole hour. Yet another thing about Harry, how little he looked forward to his birthdays. He never received a birthday card in his life. The Dursleys had completely ignored his last 2 birthdays, and he had no reason to suppose that they would remember this one. Harry walked across the dark room, past Hedwig's large, empty cage, and to the open window. He leaned on the sill, the cool night air pleasant on his face after a long time under the blankets. Hedwig had been absent for 2 nights now. Harry wasn't worried about her. She'd been gone this long before, but he hoped she'd be back soon. She was the only living creature in this house who didn't flinch at the sight of him. Harry, though, still rather small and skinny for his age, had grown inches over the last year. His jet black hair, however, was just as it always had been, stubbornly untidy whatever he did to it. The eyes behind his glasses were bright green, and on his forehead, clearly visible through his hair, was a thin scar shaped like a lightning bolt. Of all the unusual things about Harry, his scar was the most extraordinary of all. It was not, as the Dursleys had pretended for 10 years, a souvenir of a car crash that killed Harry's parents, because Lily and James Potter had not died in a car crash. They had been murdered. Murdered by the most feared dark wizard for 100 years, Lord Voldemort. Harry had escaped from the same attack, with nothing but more than a scar on his forehead, when Voldemort's curse, instead of killing him, had rebounded upon its originator. Barely alive, Voldemort had fled. But Harry had come face to face with him since at Hogwarts, remembering their last meeting as he stood at the dark window. Harry had to admit that he was lucky even to have reached his 13th birthday. He scanned the starry sky for a sign of Hedwig, perhaps soaring back to him with a dead mouse dangling in her beak, expecting praise. Gazing absently over the rooftops, it was a few seconds before Harry realised what he was seeing. Silhouetted against the golden moon, and growing larger with every moment, was a large, strangely lopsided creature, and it was flapping in Harry's direction. He stood quite still, watching it sink lower and lower. For a split second he hesitated, his hand on the window latch, wondering whether to slam it shut. But then the bizarre creature soared over one of the street lamps of Privet Drive, and Harry realised what it was, and he leapt aside. Through the window soared 3 owls, 2 of them holding up the third, which appeared to be unconscious. They landed with a soft flump on Harry's bed, and the middle owl, which was a large, grey, uh, keeled right over and lay motionless. There was a large package tied to its legs. Harry recognised the unconscious owl at once. His name was Errol, and he belonged to the Weasley family. Harry dashed to the bed at once, untied the cords around Errol's legs, and took off the parcel, and then carried Errol to Hedwig's cage. Errol opened one bleary eye and gave a feeble hoot of thanks and began to gulp some water. Harry turned back to the remaining owls. One of them was a large, snowy female, his own Hedwig. She too was carrying a parcel and looked extremely pleased with herself. She gave Harry an affectionate nip with her beak as he removed her burden, and then flew across the room to join Errol. Harry didn't recognise the third owl, a handsome tawny one, but he knew at once where it had come from, because in addition to a third parcel, it was carrying a letter bearing the Hogwarts crest. When Harry had relieved the owl of its post, it ruffled its feathers importantly, stretched its wings, and took off through the window into the night. Harry sat down on his bed, grabbed Errol's package, ripped off the brown paper, and discovered a present wrapped in gold and his first ever birthday card. Fingers trembling slightly, he opened the envelope. 2 pieces of paper fell out, a letter and a news cutting. The cutting had clearly come out of some wizarding newspaper, the Daily Prophet, because the people in the people in the black and white picture were moving. Harry picked up the cutting, smoothed it out, and read, "Ministry of Magic employee scoops grand prize. Arthur Weasley, head of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office at the Ministry of Magic, has won the annual Daily Prophet Grand Prize Galleon Draw." A delighted Mr. Weasley told the Daily Prophet, "We will be spending the gold on a summer holiday in Egypt, where our eldest son Bill works as a curse breaker for Gringotts Wizarding Bank." The Weasley family will be spending a month in Egypt, returning for the start of the new school year at Hogwarts, which 5 of the Weasley children currently attend. Harry scanned at the moving photograph. A grin spread across his face as he saw all 9 Weasleys waving furiously at him, standing in front of a large pyramid. Plump little Mrs. Weasley, tall, balding Mr. Weasley, 6 sons and 1 daughter, although the black and white picture didn't show it off, with flaming red hair. Right in the middle of the picture was Ron, tall and gangling, with his pet rat Scabbers on his shoulder and his arm around his little sister Ginny. Harry couldn't think of anyone who deserved to win a large pile of gold more than the Weasleys, who were very nice but extremely poor. He picked up Ron's letter and unfolded it. Dear Harry, happy birthday. Look, I'm really sorry about that telephone call. I hope the Muggles didn't give you a hard time. I asked Dad, and he reckons I shouldn't have shouted. It's brilliant here in Egypt. Bill's taken us around all the tombs, and you wouldn't believe the curses those old Egyptian wizards had put on them. Mum wouldn't let Ginny come in the last one because there were these mutant skeletons in there of Muggles who had broken in and grown extra heads and stuff. I couldn't believe it when Dad won the Daily Profit draw. 700 galleons. Most of it's gone on this holiday, but they're going to buy me a new wand for next year. He remembered only too well the occasion when Ron's old wand had snapped. It had happened when the car the 2 of them had been flying into Hogwarts with had crashed into a tree in the school grounds. We'll be back about a week before term starts. We'll be going up to London to get my wand and our new books. Any chance of meeting you there? Don't let the Muggles get you down. Try and come to London. Ron. P.S. Percy's head boy. He got the letter last week. Harry glanced back at the photograph. Percy, who was in his 7th and final year of Hogwarts, looked particularly smug, as he had pinned his head boy badge to the fez perched jauntily on top of his neat hair. His horn-rimmed glasses flashed in the Egyptian sun. Harry now turned to his present and unwrapped it. Inside was what looked like a miniature glass spinning top. There was another note from Ron beneath it. Harry, this is a pocket sneakoscope. If there's someone untrustworthy around, it's supposed to light up and spin. Bill says it's rubbish sold for wizard tourists, and it isn't reliable, because it kept lighting up at dinner last night, but I didn't realise Fred and George had put beetles in his soup. Bye, Ron. Harry put the pocket sneakoscope on his bedside table, where it stood quite still, balanced on its point, reflecting the luminous hands of his clock. Harry looked at it happily for a few seconds, then picked up the parcel Hedwig had brought. Inside this, too, was wrapped a present, a card and a letter from Hermione. Dear Harry, Ron wrote to me and told me about his phone call to your Uncle Vernon. I do hope you're all right. I'm on holiday in France at the moment. I don't know how I was going to send this to you, what happened if they'd opened it at customs, but then Hedwig turned up. I think she wanted to make sure you got something for your birthday for a change. I brought your present by oil order. There was an advertisement in the Daily Prophet. I've been getting it delivered. It's so good to keep up with what's going on in the wizarding world. Did you see that picture of Ron and his family a week ago? I bet he's learning loads. I'm really jealous. The ancient Egyptian wizards were fascinating. There's some interesting local history of witchcraft here too. I've rewritten my whole history of magic essay to include some of the things I found. I hope it's not too long. It's 2 rolls of parchment more than Professor Binns asked for. Ron says he's going to be in London in the last week of the holidays. Can you make it? Will your aunt and uncle let you come? I really hope you can. If not, I'll see you at Hogwarts on the Express on September the 1st. Love, Hermione. P.S. Ron says Percy's head boy. I bet Percy's really pleased. Ron doesn't seem too happy about it. Harry laughed again as he put Hermione's letter aside and picked up her present. It was very heavy. Knowing Hermione, He was sure it would be a large book full of very difficult spells, but it wasn't. His heart gave a huge bound as he ripped back the paper and saw a sleek black leather case with silver words stamped across it. Broomstick Servicing Kit. Whoa, Hermione, Harry whispered, unzipping the case to look inside. It was a large jar of Fleetwood's high finish uh, po- handle polish. That's quite the tongue twister. High finish handle polish. A pair of gleaming silver teal twig clippers, a tiny brass compass to clip onto your broom for long journeys, and a handbook of do-it-yourself broom care. Apart from his friends, the thing that Harry missed most about Hogwarts was Quidditch, the most popular sport in the magical world, highly dangerous, very exciting, and played on broomsticks. Harry happened to be a very good Quidditch player. He'd been the youngest person in a century to be picked for one of the Hogwarts house teams. One of Harry's most prized possessions was his Nimbus 2000 racing broom. Take a pause here to point out that yes, my chinchilla, who you are currently looking at, sleeping in his cage, is indeed named for the Nimbus of Harry's broom. That's a fun fact, maybe. Apart from his friends, the thing that Harry missed most about Hogwarts. Oh, we've said that, haven't we? Where'd we go? Harry put his leather case aside and picked up his last parcel. He recognised the untidy scrawl on the brown paper at once. This was from Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper. He tore off the top layer of paper and glimpsed something green and leathery, but before he could unwrap it properly, the parcel gave a strange quiver, and whatever it was inside snapped loudly, as though it had jaws. Harry froze. He knew that Hagrid would never send him anything dangerous on purpose. But then, Hagrid didn't have a normal person's view of what was dangerous. Hagrid had been known to befriend giant spiders, buy vicious three-headed dogs from men in pubs, and sneak illegal dragon eggs into his cabin. Harry poked the parcel nervously. It snapped loudly again. He reached for the lamp on the bedside table, gripped it firmly in one hand, and raised it over his head, ready to strike. Then he seized the rest of the wrapping paper on his other hand and pulled, and out fell a book. Harry had just time to register its handsome green cover, emblazoned with the golden title, The Monster Book of Monsters, before it flipped onto its edge and scuttled away under the bed like some weird crab. Uh-oh, Harry muttered. The book toppled off the bed with a loud clunk and shuffled rapidly across the room. Harry followed it stealthily. The book was hiding in the dark space under his bed. Praying that the Dursleys were fast asleep, Harry got down on his hands and knees and reached out towards it. Ouch! The book snapped shut on his hand and then flapped past him, still scurrying on its covers. Harry scrambled around, threw himself forward, and managed to flatten it. Uncle Vernon gave a large, sleepy grunt from the room next door. Hedwig and Errol watched interestedly as Harry clamped the book tightly in his arms, hurried to his chest of drawers, and pulled out a belt, which he buckled tightly around it. The monster book shuddered angrily, but could no longer flap and snap, so Harry threw it down on the bed and reached for Hagrid's card. Dear Harry, happy birthday. You might find this useful for next year. Won't say no more here. Tell you when I see you. Hope the Muggles are treating you right. All the best, Hagrid. It struck Harry as ominous that Hagrid thought a biting book would come in useful. But he put up Hagrid's card next to Ron and Hermione's, grinning more broadly than ever. Now there was only the letter from Hogwarts left. Noticing that it was rather thicker than usual, Harry slid open the envelope, pulled out the first page of parchment within, and read, Dear Mr. Potter, please note that the new school year will begin on September the 1st. The Hogwarts Express will leave from King's Cross Station, platform 9 3/4 at 11 o'clock. Third years are permitted to visit the village of Hogsmeade at certain weekends. Please give the enclosed permission form to your parent or guardian to sign. A list of books for next year is enclosed. Yours sincerely, Professor M. McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Harry pulled out the Hogsmeade permission form and looked at it, no longer grinning. It would be wonderful to visit Hogsmeade at the weekends. He knew it was an entire wizarding village, but he'd never set foot there. But how on earth was he going to persuade Uncle Vernon or Aunt Petunia to sign this form? He looked over at the alarm clock. It was now 2 o'clock in the morning. Deciding he'd worry about the Hogsmeade form whenever he woke up, Harry got back into bed, reached up to cross off another day on the chart he'd made for himself, counting down the days until his return to Hogwarts. Then he took off his glasses and lay down, eyes open, facing his 3 birthday cards. Extremely unusual though, as he was, at that moment Harry Potter felt like everyone else, glad for the first time in his life that it was his birthday. Oh, and that's the end of chapter 1. I'm my throat. Alright, I need a water. I'll be 2 seconds. Alright, chapter 2. This one's called Aunt Marge's Big Mistake. Harry went down to breakfast next morning to find the Dursleys already sitting around the kitchen table. They were watching a brand new television, a welcome home for the summer present for Dudley, who had been complaining loudly about the long walk between the fridge and the television in the living room. Dudley had spent most of the summer in the kitchen, his piggy little eyes fixed on the screen, and his 5 chins wobbling continuously as he ate. Harry sat down between Dudley and Uncle Vernon, a large beefy man with very little neck and a lot of moustache. Far from wishing Harry a happy birthday, none of the Dursleys gave any sign that they had noticed Harry even enter the room. But Harry was far too used to this to care. He helped himself to a piece of toast and then looked up at the newsreader on the television, who was halfway through a public report on an escaped convict. The public is warned that Black is armed and extremely dangerous. A special hotline has been set up for any sighting of Black and should be reported immediately. No need to tell us he's no good, snorted Uncle Vernon, staring over the top of the newspaper at the prisoner. Look at the state of him, the filthy layabout. Look at his hair. He shot a nasty look sideways at Harry, whose untidy hair had always been the source of great annoyance to Uncle Vernon. Compared to the man on the television, however, whose gaunt face was surrounded by matted, elbow-length tangle, Harry felt very well groomed indeed. The newsreader had reappeared. The Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries will announce today. Hang on, barked Uncle Vernon, staring furiously at the newsreader. You didn't tell us where the maniacs escaped from. What use is that? The lunatic could be coming up the street right now. Aunt Petunia, who was bony and horse-faced, whipped around and peered intently out of the kitchen window. Harry knew Aunt Petunia would simply love to be the one to call the hotline number. She was the nosiest woman in the world and spent most of her life spying on her boring, law-abiding neighbours. When will they learn, said Uncle Vernon, pounding the table with a large purple fist, that hanging's the only way to deal with these people? Very true, said Aunt Virginia, who was still squinting into next door's runner beans. Uncle Vernon drained his cup, glanced at his watch, and added, I'd better be off in a minute. Virginia, Marge's train gets in at 10. Harry, whose thoughts had been upstairs with the broomstick servicing kit, was brought back to earth with an unpleasant bump. Aunt Marge, he blurted out. She's not coming here, is she? Aunt Marge was Uncle Vernon's sister, even though she was not a blood relative of Harry's, whose mother had been Aunt Virginia's sister. He had been forced to call her Aunt all his life. Aunt Marge lived in the country, in a house with a large garden where she bred bulldogs. She didn't often stay in Privet Drive, because she couldn't bear to leave her precious dogs, but each of her visits stood out horribly vividly in Harry's mind. At Dudley's 5th birthday party, Aunt Marge had whacked Harry round the shins with her walking stick to stop him beating Dudley at musical statues. A few years later, she had turned up at the Christmas event with a computerized robot for Dudley and a box of dog biscuits for Harry. On her last visit, the year before Harry had started at Hogwarts, Harry had accidentally trodden on the paw of her favourite dog. Ripper had chased Harry out into the garden and up a tree, and Aunt Marge refused to call him off until past midnight. The memory of this incident still brought tears of laughter to Dudley's eyes. Marge will be here for a week, Uncle Vernon snarled, and while we're on the subject, he pointed a fat finger threateningly at Harry. We need to go through a few things before I go and collect her. Dudley smirked and withdrew his gaze from the television. Watching Harry being bullied by Uncle Vernon was Dudley's favourite form of entertainment. Firstly, growled Uncle Vernon, you keep a civil tongue in your head when you're talking to Aunt Marge. All right, said Harry bitterly, if she does when she's talking to me. Secondly, said Uncle Vernon, acting as though he had not heard Harry's reply, as Marge doesn't know anything about your abnormality, I don't want any funny stuff while she's here. You behave yourself, got me? I will if she does, Harry said through gritted teeth. And thirdly, said Uncle Vernon, his mean little eyes now slits in his great purple face, we've told Marge that you attend St. Brutus's Secure Centre for Incurably Criminal Boys. What? Harry yelled. And you'll be sticking to that story, boy, or there'll be trouble, spat Uncle Vernon. Harry sat there, white-faced and furious, staring at Uncle Vernon, hardly able to believe it. Aunt Marge was coming for a week-long visit. This was the worst birthday present the Dursleys had ever given him, including that pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks. Well, Petunia, said Uncle Vernon, getting heavily to his feet, I'll be off to the station then. Want to come along for the ride, Didders? No, said Dudley, whose attention had returned to the television, now that Uncle Vernon had finished threatening Harry. Dudley's got to make himself smart for his auntie, said Aunt Petunia, smoothing Dudley's thick blonde hair. Mummy's brought him a lovely new bow tie. Uncle Vernon clapped Dudley on his porky shoulder. See you in a bit then, he said, as he left the kitchen. Harry, who had been sitting in a kind of horrified trance, now had a sudden idea. Abandoning his toast, he got quickly to his feet and followed Uncle Vernon to the door. Uncle Vernon was pulling on his car coat. I'm not taking you, he snarled, as he turned to see Harry watching him. Like I wanted to come, said Harry coldly. I want to ask you something. Uncle Vernon eyed him suspiciously. Third years at my school are allowed to visit the village sometimes, said Harry. So, snapped Uncle Vernon, taking his car keys from a hook next to the door. I need you to sign the permission form, said Harry in a rush. And why should I do that? Sneered Uncle Vernon. Well, said Harry, choosing his words carefully, it'll be hard work, pretending to Aunt Marge I go to St. Brutus's Secure Centre for Incurably Criminal Boys, bellowed Uncle Vernon, and Harry was pleased to hear a definite note of panic in Uncle Vernon's voice. Exactly, said Harry, looking calmly up to Uncle Vernon's large purple face. That's a lot to remember. I have to make it sound convincing, won't I? What if I accidentally let something slip. You'll get the stuffing knocked out of you, won't you? Roared Uncle Vernon, advancing on Harry with his fist raised, but Harry stood his ground. Knocking the stuffing out of me won't make Aunt Marge forget what I could tell her, he said grimly. Uncle Vernon stopped, his fist still raised, his face ugly, an ugly prince. But if you sign my permission form, Harry went on quickly, I swear I'll remember everything I'm supposed to about that school, and then I'll act like a mug, like I'm normal and everything. Harry could tell that Uncle Vernon was thinking it over. Even his teeth were bared, and a vein throbbing in his temple. Right, he finally snapped. I shall monitor your behaviour carefully during Marge's visit. If, at the end of it, you've toed the line and kept to the story, I'll sign your ruddy form. He wheeled around, pulled open the front door, and slammed it so hard that one of the little panes of glass at the top fell out. Harry didn't return to the kitchen. He went back upstairs to his bedroom. If he was going to act like a muggle, he'd better start now. Slowly and sadly, he gathered up all his presents, his birthday cards, and hid them under the loose floorboard with his homework. He then went to Hedwig's cage. Errol seemed to have recovered. He and Hedwig were both asleep, heads under their wings. Harry sighed, then poked them both awake. Hedwig, he said gloomily, you're going to have to clear off for a week. Go with Errol. Ron will look after you. I'll write him a note explaining. Don't look at me like that. Hedwig's large amber eyes were reproachful. It's not my fault. It's the only way I'll be able to visit Hogsmeade with Ron and Hermione. 10 minutes later, Errol and Hedwig, who had a note to Ron bound to her leg, soared out of the window and out of sight. Harry, now feeling thoroughly miserable, put the empty cage away inside the wardrobe. But Harry didn't have too long to brood. In next to no time, Aunt Petunia was shrieking up the stairs for Harry to come down and get ready to welcome their guest. Do something about your hair, Aunt Petunia snapped as he reached the hall. Harry couldn't see the point of trying to make his hair lie flat. Aunt Marge loved criticising him, so the untidier he looked, the happier she would be. All too soon, there was a crunch of gravel outside as Uncle Vernon's car pulled back up into the driveway, then the clunk of the car doors and footsteps on the garden path. Get the door, Aunt Petunia hissed at Harry. A feeling of great gloom in his stomach, Harry pulled open the door. On the threshold stood Aunt Marge. She was very like Uncle Vernon, large, beefy, and purple-faced. She even had a moustache, though not as bushy as his. In one hand she held an enormous suitcase, and tucked under the other was an old and evil-tempered bulldog. "Where's my dudders?" roared Aunt Marge. "Where's my Neffy Poo?" Dudley came waddling down the hall, his blond hair plastered flat to his fat head, bow tie just visible under his many chins. Aunt Marge thrust the suitcase into Harry's stomach, knocking the wind out of him, and seized Dudley in a tight, one-armed hug and planted a large kiss on his cheek. Harry knew perfectly well that Dudley only put up with Aunt Marge's hugs because he was paid well for it, and, sure enough, when they broke apart, Dudley held a crisp £20 note clutched in his fat fist. "Petunia!" shouted Aunt Marge, striding past Harry as though he was a hat stand. Aunt Marge and Aunt Petunia kissed, or rather, Aunt Marge bumped her large jaw against Aunt Petunia's bony cheekbone. Uncle Vernon now came in, smiling jovially as he shut the door. "Tea, Marge, and what will Ripper take?" "Ripper can have some tea out of my saucer," said Aunt Marge, and they all trooped into the kitchen, leaving Harry alone in the hall with the suitcase. But Harry wasn't complaining. Any excuse not to be with Aunt Marge was fine by him, so he began to heave the case upstairs into the spare bedroom, taking as long as he could. By the time he got back to the kitchen, Aunt Marge had been supplied with tea and fruit cake, and Ripper was lapping noisily in the corner. Harry saw Aunt Petunia wince as specks of tea and drool flecked her clean floor. Aunt Petunia hated animals. "Who's looking after the dogs, Marge?" Uncle Vernon asked. "Oh, I've got Connell Fubster managing them," boomed Aunt Marge. "He's retired now. Good for him to have something to do. but I just can't leave my old Ripper. He pines if I'm away. Ripper began to growl again as Harry sat down. This directed Aunt Marge's attention to Harry for the first time. So, she barked, still here, are you? Yes, said Harry. Don't you say yes in that ungrateful tone, Aunt Marge growled. It's damn good of Vernon and Petunia to keep you. Wouldn't have done it myself. You'd have gone straight to an orphanage if you'd been dumped on my doorstep. Harry was bursting to say he'd rather live at an orphanage than with the Dursleys, but the thought of Hogsmeade stopped him. He forced his face into a painful smile. Don't you smirk at me, boomed Aunt Marge. I can see you haven't improved since I last saw you. I'd hoped school would have knocked some manners into you. She took a large cup of tea and wiped her moustache and said, Where is it you sent him again, Vernon? St. Brutus's, said Uncle Vernon promptly. It's a first-rate institution for hopeless cases. I see, said Aunt Marge. Do they use the cane at St. Brutus's Boy? She barked across the table. Uh, Uncle Vernon nodded curtly behind Aunt Marge's back. Yeah, said Harry, then feeling that he might as well do the thing properly, he added, all the time. Excellent, said Aunt Marge. I won't have this namby-pamby, wishy-washy nonsense about not hitting people who don't deserve it. A good thrashing, that's what's needed in 99 cases out of 100. Have you been beaten often? Oh, yeah, said Harry, loads of times. Aunt Marge narrowed her eyes. I still don't like your tone, boy, she said. If you can speak of your beatings in a casual way, they clearly aren't hitting you hard enough. Petunia, if I were you, I'd write, make it clear that you approve of the use of extreme force in this boy's case. Perhaps Uncle Vernon was worried that Harry might forget the bargain. In any case, he changed the subject abruptly. Heard the news this morning, Marge? What about that escaped prisoner, eh? As Aunt Marge started to make herself at home, Harry caught himself thinking almost longingly of life at number 4 Privet Drive without her. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia usually encouraged Harry to stay out of their way, which Harry was more than happy to do. Aunt Marge, on the other hand, wanted Harry under her eye at all times, so that she could boom out suggestions for his improvement. She delighted in comparing Harry to Dudley, and took huge pleasure in buying Dudley expensive presents while glaring at Harry as though daring him to ask us why he hadn't got a present too. She also kept throwing out dark hints about what made Harry such an unsatisfactory person. You mustn't blame yourself for the way the boys turned out, Vernon, she said over lunch on the third day. If there's something rotten on the inside, there's nothing anyone can do about it. Harry tried hard to concentrate on his food, but his hands shook and his face was starting to burn with anger. Remember the form, he told himself. Think about Hogsmeade. Don't say anything. Don't rise. Aunt Marge reached for her wine glass. It's one of the basic rules of breeding, she said. You see it all the time with dogs. If there's something wrong with the bitch, there's always something wrong with the pup. At that moment, the wine glass that Aunt Marge was holding exploded in her hands. The shards of glass flew in every direction, and Aunt Marge spluttered and blinked, her great ruddy face dripping. Marge, squealed Aunt Petunia. Marge, are you all right? Not to worry, grunted Aunt Marge, mopping her face with her napkin. Must have squeezed it too hard. Did the same thing at Colonel Fubster's the other day. No need to fuss, Petunia. I have a very firm grip. But Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon were both looking at Harry suspiciously, so he decided he'd better skip pudding and escape from the table while he still could. Outside in the hall, he leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. It had been a long time since he'd lost control and made something explode. He couldn't afford to let that happen again. The Hogsmeade form wasn't the only thing at stake. If he carried on like that, he'd be in trouble from the Ministry of Magic. Harry was still an underage wizard and was forbidden by wizard law to do magic outside of school. His record wasn't exactly clean either. Only last summer he'd gotten an official warning which quite clearly stated that if the Ministry got wind of any more magic in Privet Drive, Harry would face expulsion from Hogwarts. He heard the Dursleys leaving the table and hurried upstairs out of the way. Harry got through the next 3 days by forcing himself to think about his handbook of do-it-yourself broom care whenever Aunt Marge started on him. This worked quite well, although seemed to give him a glazed look because Aunt Marge started voicing the opinion that he was mentally subnormal. At long last, the final evening of Marge's stay arrived. Aunt Petunia had cooked a fancy dinner, and Uncle Vernon uncorked several bottles of wine. They got all the way through the soup and salmon without a single mention of Harry's faults. During the lemon meringue pie, Uncle Vernon bored them all with a long talk about Grunnings, his drill-making company. Then Aunt Petunia made coffee, and Uncle Vernon brought out a bottle of brandy. "Can I tempt you, Marge?" Marge had already had rather a lot of wine. Her huge face was very red. "Just a small one, then," she chuckled. "A bit more than that. A bit more. That's the boy." Dudley was eating his fourth slice of pie. Aunt Petunia was sipping coffee, and her little finger was sticking out. Harry really wanted to disappear into his bedroom, but he met Uncle Vernon's angry little eyes and knew he'd have to sit it out. "Ah," said Aunt Marge, smacking her lips and putting the empty brandy glass back down. "Excellent nosh, Petunia. It's normally a fright for me uh, of an evening, with 12 dogs to look after." She burped richly and patted her great tweed stomach. "Pardon me, but I do like to see a healthy-sized boy," she went on, winking at Dudley. "You'll be a proper-sized man, Dudders, like your father. Yes, I'll have a spot more brandy, Vernon. Now this one here," she jerked her head at Harry, who felt his stomach clench. "The handbook," he thought quickly. "This one's a mean, runty look about him. You get that with dogs. I had Colonel Fubster drown one last year. Ratty little thing it was. Weak, underfed, underbred." Harry was trying to remember page 12 of his book. A charm to cure reluctant reluctant reversers. It all comes down to blood. As I was saying the other day, bad blood will out. Now, I'm not saying anything against your family, Petunia. She patted Aunt Petunia's bony hand with her shovel-like one. "But your sister was a bad egg. They turn up in the best families. She ran off with that rascal, and here's the result right in front of us." Harry was staring at his plate, a funny ringing in his ears. "Grasp your broom firmly by the tail," he thought, but he couldn't remember what came next. Aunt Marge's voice seemed to be boring into him, like one of Uncle Vernon's drills. "This Potter," said Aunt Marge loudly, seizing the brandy bottle and splashing more into her glass and over the tablecloth. "You never told me what he did." Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia were looking extremely tense. Dudley had even looked up from his pie to gape at his parents. "He didn't work," said Uncle Vernon, with half a glance at Harry. "Unemployed." "As I expected," said Aunt Marge, taking a huge swig of brandy and wiping her chin on her sleeve. "And no account, good for nothing, lazy scrounger who—" "He was not," said Harry suddenly. The table went very quiet. Harry was shaking all over. He'd never felt so angry in all his life. "More brandy!" yelled Uncle Vernon, who had gone very white, emptied the bottle into Aunt Marge's glass. "You boy," he snarled at Harry. "Go to bed. Go on." "No, Vernon," hiccuped Aunt Marge, holding up a hand, her tiny bloodshot eyes fixed on Harry's. "Go on, boy, go on. Proud of your parents, were you? They go and get themselves killed in a car crash. Drunk, I expect." "They didn't die in a car crash," said Harry, who found himself on his feet. "They died in a car crash, you nasty little liar, and left you a burden on your decent, hard-working relatives," screamed Aunt Marge, swelling with fury. "You're an insolent, ungrateful little—" But Aunt Marge had stopped speaking. For a moment it looked as though words had failed her. She seemed to be swelling with inexpressible anger, but the swelling didn't stop. Her great red face started to expand. Her tiny eyes bulged and her mouth stretched too tightly for speech. The next second, several buttons burst from her tweed jacket and pinged off the walls. She was inflating like a monstrous balloon, her stomach bursting free of her tweed waistband, each of her fingers blowing up like a salami. "Marge!" yelled Uncle Vernon and Aunt Virginia together, as Aunt Marge's whole body began to rise off her chair towards the ceiling. She was entirely round now, like a vast life buoy, with piggy eyes. Her hands and feet stuck out weirdly as she drifted up into the air, making apologetic popping noises. It's not apologetic. A pop. A apoplectic. Apo. Apoplectic. Popping noises. Ripper came skidding into the room, barking madly. No! Uncle Vernon seized one of Aunt Marge's feet and tried to pull her down again, but was almost lifted off the floor himself. Next second, Ripper had leapt forward and sunk his teeth into Uncle Vernon's leg. Harry tore from the dining room before anyone could stop him, heading for the cupboard under the stairs. The cupboard door had burst magically open as he reached it. In seconds, he had heaved his trunk to the front door. He sprinted upwards and threw himself under the bed, wrenched open the loose floorboard, and grabbed the pillowcase full of stuff and birthday presents. He wriggled out, seized Hedwig's empty cage, and dashed back downstairs to his trunk as Uncle Vernon burst into the dining room, his trouser leg in bloody tatters. "Come back here," he bellowed. "Come back and put her right." But a reckless rage had come over Harry. He kicked his trunk open, pulled out his wand, and pointed at Uncle Vernon. "She deserved it," Harry said, breathing very fast. "She deserved what she got. You keep away from me." He fumbled behind him for the catch on the door. "I'm going," said Harry. "I've had enough." And the next moment he was out in the dark, quiet street, heaving his trunk behind him, Hedwig's cage under his arm. End of chapter 2. I'm going to leave it there for today. Thank you for listening. We'll do more Harry Potter later on in the week.